Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back my friend, Rod Adams, for his second appearance on the Power Hungry Podcast. Rod, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a while.
It has been a while. It was December of 2020, which makes it about 3 years. So that's been far too long. And a lot has happened in the nuclear sector. Now, I did not mention, I didn't give you the proper introduction, or just, as you know, the brief introduction. You're the managing partner at NuScale Capital and the publisher of Atomic Insights. But as you know, guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So you know the drill. You have 60 seconds. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Rod Adams. I'm a native Floridian, which makes me kind of a rare breed. Grew up loving nuclear power, partly because Dad was an electrical engineer for a company that was building new nuclear plants, and introduced me to a power plant by saying, "Hey, Rod, this kind of power plant doesn't even have smokestacks." After learning about that and then deciding that energy was a big part of our economy, and being a child of the 1970s, I think you and I are almost exactly the same age, Robert.
Yeah.
I was impacted by two major energy crises during my formative years and decided that I wanted to do something about that. So I joined the Navy to learn about nuclear energy, joined the nuclear submarine force after having been interviewed by Admiral Rickover himself. It was about a 60-second long interview. We'll talk about that someday. Very short story.
I do want to hear about that. I haven't so I didn't realize that. But please, well, so go ahead, continue.
And then served on submarines for most of the 1980s, surfaced 1991 at a time when the U.S. was once again fighting over oil. Decided that there was some reason that the rest of the world didn't like nuclear as much as I did. Decided to try to do something about that. Developed a small modular reactor design in my free time. Left the Navy. Left active duty to start Adams Atomic Engines in 1993. Realized that we were a little ahead of the bleeding edge. Went back into the active duty Navy. Finished serving my career, having done a lot of work at Navy headquarters related to nuclear submarines and training. Joined a small modular reactor company called B&W Empower. Didn't do so well at that project. We were a beautiful design, but never managed to apply to the NRC for a license. Investors got tired of spending $100 million a year on the project, pulled the plug. I had decided about 3 months ahead of them pulling the plug that I needed to go do something else. And anyway, so been working on investing in advanced nuclear and small modular reactors for the last 5 years. NuScale Capital has been investing now officially for 2 years, and we've made investments in 10 different companies in the space.
Gotcha. Well, let's bring us up to date. I've written recently about the cancellation of the NuScale Power project with UAMPS in Idaho. I was just looking at NuScale's stock price this morning. It's down over 75% for the year to date. Down again early today in early trading, another 5%. Let's talk about that deal specifically. Why did that deal, which was the only commercial contract that has been signed for a small modular reactor that has had a design approved by the NRC, why did that deal fall apart?
I wrote a post about this about a week or so ago. The deal from the beginning was set by a number of conditions. One was that the customers back in the 2012, 2013 timeframe believed that there was going to be some reason why they would need to leave carbon behind, that there would be either a price on carbon, there would be some sort of mandates reducing carbon, all kinds of things that they said, we really need to have this carbon-free power project. Well, those conditions didn't come to fruition. There's no disadvantage economically in the Western states that are served by UAMPS for burning carbon. So there's no incentive to do something cleaner, economically anyway. There may be some moral incentive, but it's just as cheap for the customers to keep burning coal or burning natural gas. So that was part of the problem.
Put it another way, it was too expensive, right? Because that was the key, that the price per megawatt hour went from $60 to $90.
It's not that it's too expensive. On the east coast of the U.S., people are willingly signing contracts with offshore wind for $150 a megawatt hour, $180 a megawatt hour, $200 a megawatt hour. So it's not that the power from the NuScale project was too expensive. It was too expensive in the market it was trying to serve.
Okay.
It cost $89 a megawatt hour, which is a lot more expensive than burning coal in existing coal-fired power plants,
right,
or burning natural gas in even brand new combined cycle natural gas turbines, right, especially in an area where there's what's called associated gas available.
Right.
In North Dakota, they're drilling and fracking for oil, and by the very nature of it, natural gas comes out as well.
Right.
But they don't have the infrastructure for getting rid of the gas, so they almost give it away. Because if they didn't give it away, they have to flare.
Right. So it came down ultimately, if I'm paraphrasing what you said, it just came down to simple economics, that it ultimately didn't work in that market at that price.
Yes, especially since they were going to build a 462 megawatt power plant on the Idaho National Lab site.
Right.
And if you've ever been to the Idaho National Lab site, it's 800 square miles of nothing. There's nothing there except for a few installations. It's wide open plains. So you got to build transmission lines because there's no customers for 862 megawatts nearby.
Right. Well, but is this a black eye? I know this is where you're investing, and I'm hopeful. I've been pro-nuclear for a long time, not as long as you, but for 15 years. So I've been saying the same thing, natural gas to nuclear. How big of a black eye, or how is this a checkup or a check on the whole SMR industry? Is it indicative that the whole industry may not work out as people have been hoping?
I sure hope that's not the lesson that people take away. First of all, it's one project, not even really indicative of whether NuScale is going to survive or not, whether NuScale is going to prosper or not. It was simply one project, one customer in one market. NuScale has gone through the process of getting a certification. They started a long time ago. NuScale has been operating and working at this since the early 2000s. I think I interviewed Jose Reyes and Paul Lorenzini on the Atomic Show podcast in 2006. But it was a troubled project to begin with. It was a group, 40 some odd municipal utilities who may not have shareholders, but they've got what's more important. They've got customers that live in the same town as the decision makers. They're the guys that shake the trees and say, hey, guys, why are you approving this project that's going to raise my electricity bill by 20% or 50% or whatever it would do?
Right.
And they don't have even the power of going to the capital markets. They're a nonprofit municipal utilities who certainly can access lower interest loans,
right,
but not interest-free loans.
Sure.
They still are got to pay some price relative to the market. So if the interest rates go up for the general market, they're going to go up for UAMPS too. So anyway, there's lots of reasons why it shouldn't be indicative. The technology is somewhat evolutionary. It's not revolutionary. The natural circulation system that NuScale developed works fine, will last a long time. But putting it in a 4.5 million gallon tank of water that has to meet the NRC's aircraft impact assessment, may have been a bridge too far. May have been
Well, let's follow.
somewhat too expensive.
So let's follow on that, because I've heard that same discussion about NuScale's technology, that it had this massive this water cooling system. But I'm looking at Iceberg Research. They shorted NuScale, and I'm guessing they made a lot of money. And they're pointing out. I'm just looking at I pulled it up. They point out NuScale says they have a solid balance sheet, 197 million of cash at the end of September, no debt. This perspective overlooks NuScale's rapid cash burn of 154 million over the past 9 months, and ignores the impact of the UAM's contract termination, which adds 63 million. So, I mean, as I read that, I'm thinking, well, there's a possibility that NuScale just fails. I mean, that they go bust. There's one other indicator here that has happened just in the last few days, which is that X Energy, which I've been bullish on their technology because of the high temperature gas cooled reactor. They have the site and an agreement with Dow in Seadrift, Texas, to put in 4 of their modules, 4 of their reactors at that site. But they just canceled their deal with Ares Acquisition Corporation. They're not going to go public now. I don't know whether NuScale Power is still planning to go public. Sam Altman was going to be their backer, but now Sam Altman's having some trouble. So, it does seem like it's not just one car wreck here in the SMR space. It's multiple car wrecks. And it's to me, it's very concerning. So, well, let me just high grade this. So how much of this is high interest rates? Because this, one of the points that's been made several times is the same impact that the high interest rates are having a big impact on the renewable sector, because these are front-loaded projects that have a lot of upfront costs and they don't get immediate payback or a very quick payback. Are the same headwinds that are hurting renewables hurting nuclear in that regard? Is supply chain high interest rates?
Absolutely. Capital intensive projects are absolutely impacted by high interest rates to a great degree. I mean, just think about if you, again, we're about the same age. So when I graduated from college and wanted to buy my first house, interest rates were 13%.
Mm-hmm.
The monthly payments for my $70,000 house in 1983 were higher than my $130,000 house in 1987, right, when interest rates had dropped down to 5%. Okay.
Right.
So that's the kind of impact that it has. Right now, I was fortunate enough to have bought my house in 2018, 3%.
Right.
What are the poor people doing today when interest rates are 7%?
Yeah.
Hugely changes what you can afford. And so nuclear is capital intensive. The operating cost of a nuclear plant is not free like it is for a windmill, but nuclear fuel is pretty cheap, pretty darn cheap. It's roughly $15 a megawatt hour, something like that. Maybe $7 a megawatt hour for just the fuel.
Right.
So it's very low cost. So high interest rates are a big problem. And by the way, that high interest rate that made it hard for me to buy my $70,000 house in 1982, 83 is exactly the same thing that made it very, very expensive for the nuclear plants that were coming online in the 1980s, because high interest rates were affecting them in a big way.
Right.
In some cases, the overruns were half interest rates.
I didn't realize that. Well, let's talk about that, because we also, there's a win. We can talk about the losses here and the things that are going badly in the SMR space, but we can also celebrate the fact that Vogtle 3, the big project, the gigawatt scale reactor AP1000 in Georgia, has achieved commercial production, and Unit 4 at Vogtle will come online in the next few months. This is a win, right? But it comes at a high cost. So to roughly twice the expected budget, twice the expected time. I was in Savannah, Georgia recently, and heard a presentation from Oglethorpe Power, and they told me I asked, what's the wholesale price of the power that you're going to be getting from those reactors? And they own 660 megawatts out of that 2,200, something like that. It's going to be about 13 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, it's not going to necessarily affect their customers that much, because they have 8,000 megawatts of other capacity, right? But 13 cents out the door. Okay, well, but if that's good for 50 years, 60 years, that's a pretty good price. So
Yeah.
that's a long introduction to this question. What went wrong at Vogtle? Because it wasn't interest rates there. What went wrong on that project?
Yeah, interest rates were exactly what went right, by the way. And
Yeah,
I wrote about this several times at the time, where interest rates were low, inflation was low, labor was cheap. Man, why aren't more people investing in new nuclear right now? Because this is the time to be built. But Vogtle had some. First of all, we hadn't built a new nuclear plant in 40 years,
right.
roughly. Started and completed. So
As a
that was a
greenfield
problem.
project.
And so the regulators, inexperienced, all of the people actually inspecting the work, had to go slowly and carefully because they don't want to make any mistakes. All of the workers had to go slowly and carefully. There were mistakes made. There were design mistakes. A designer said, I don't know exactly what the specifications should be, but this is the measurement, and I'm going to make a really tight tolerance to make it easy to get it approved by the license. Well, what that makes is it's very hard to build if your tolerance is that tight.
Right.
And that's what happened. It caused a 9-month delay when they were laying rebar, because not that the rebar was improperly laid or unsafely laid, it just didn't meet the specification on the drawing.
Right.
And the inspector, by very nature, says, "Hey, you didn't meet the spec. You got to do it over again."
Right. And I
Those are
heard
the
that.
kinds of things.
I've heard that from two different sources. One at Sargent and Lundy, and one from Oglethorpe. That in some cases, the way the drawings were done was so badly done that they had one area where it was kind of a confined space, and it was a critical part of the plant, but they could only get 2 or 3 people in there at once because they hadn't thought through the process of actually designing it to help it get built. And so, so I guess that was one of the key problems. But was it first? Okay, so you said first of a kind. We didn't have the labor. We had the regulatory issues, bad design plans, and that hadn't been vetted and hadn't been used before. But was it the combination of all of those that caused all this?
Absolutely. It's just the pylon. The design wasn't complete, but many people forget that there was real strong motivation, push for the project to get started because of many political things. There was money being offered to the nuclear industry. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 had put incentives in place, and had incentives in place that had a deadline. You had to actually finish the plant by a certain deadline. And of course, looking back, you should say, well, we're going to go faster if we are ready before we get started. But it's hard to do that when you've got these, decision processes. We haven't done it for a long time. And people said, well, let's get started. So they got started, and the design wasn't complete. They got to certain stages, and they said, well, shoot, we can't keep going because we don't know what to do next. And we've got to go back and pull out stuff. And, it's a hard thing to do. It's a very big project. Big projects are hard. Whether it's
I think
tunnel system in Boston or whether it's a bridge in California or a high-speed rail, it's hard to do big stuff.
I think Mike Smith said it when he's the CEO of Oglethorpe, and he presented in Savannah, and I was there for the Cooperative Finance Corporation convention a few days ago, and he said that at one point they had 7,000 workers on site, and that in fact and they worked through COVID, and he said in fact that one of the interesting things was that some of their most productive days were during COVID, but they were able to manage through all of that, and so it's great that it's coming online. Let's talk about then that AP1000 design. Now, there's talk. I've heard that some of the people, the key people from Bechtel, the engineering firm and construction firm that worked on Vogtle, are now in Europe, and that the next AP1000s that are built there, I think it's in Poland. Poland's going to build 5? Is that right? That now they may be able to learn from what happened at Vogtle 3 and 4. Does that ring true to you?
Oh, absolutely. I really wish that we would be applying the lessons here in the U.S. We have, well, there's actually more, but there are 4 AP1000 units in the southeastern U.S. that already have a combined operating license, a COL. 2 units at Turkey Point, 2 units at William States Lee. Those COLs are still active. They're being maintained by the owning utility. They've invested several $100 million in going through the entire environmental impact statement and all kinds of stuff. The plants are ready to go. All they need is a final investment decision by the utilities, and we could get 4 AP1000 started up. And by the way, that design is officially, provably complete.
And that's Turkey Point. And Turkey Point, and what was the other plant?
William States Lee. It's in Gaston, South Carolina, just about, 15 miles south of the North Carolina border.
Okay.
It's like the last exit off of 95. You go. I visited the site. Gosh,
in South Carolina, and Turkey Point is Pennsylvania, or is that Florida?
Turkey Point's in Homestead, Florida.
Florida. Okay, yeah, right.
It's owned by Florida Power and Light Company. That, by the way, Turkey Point, I think it was 3 or 4. I can't remember what. That was the unit that inspired me to be a nuke. Was Florida Power and Light. It's 50 miles from my home.
Right. NextEra Energy is the parent there. So right.
Yes.
And then who owns William States Lee? Who owns that project?
Duke.
Gotcha. Okay. So what about Europe? Let's go back to that. I was told it was 5 AP1000s are going to be built in Europe. Do you know that, or do you know what the particulars are there?
I think there is a project, and I don't know exactly the number. I can't remember. It's initially 2 units, and then there's options for 3 or 4 more. That's in Poland. There's 1 or 2 other people or countries that are interested in AP1000s in Europe. It's a good design. Now that it's complete, it's probably going to provide a nice capacity factor. They've got lots of good advances compared to the existing. They certainly weren't built to be constructed initially. I think there was 1,000 design changes during construction.
No kidding. At Vogtle.
And by the way, that design change process is part of what slowed it down. Not only is a design change process always a challenge in any new project, but it was particularly a challenge in the Vogtle project because the AP1000 design was a certified design. The NRC had issued a regulation approving that design. So any change to the design had to go through a license amendment process.
At the NRC.
Unlike the 2-step Part 50 process, where there's a recognition that things are going to change during design, and you have to apply for the final license once you've completed your construction. With the AP1000, it was, quote, a 1-step process where they had to make anytime they made a change, it was a license amendment. And then the final stage of the project is to do what's called ITAC, inspection, tests, certificate. I can't remember what ITAC stands for, but they had to do almost 1,000 tests and had to successfully complete each one of those ITACs in order to finish the single step of getting their project completed and ready to operate.
Wow. Well, I knew it was laborious and talking with different people around the process, but I didn't realize there were 1,000 changes. It's really well, it's remarkable. It's good, but glad, and I think the people at Oglethorpe and Southern are obviously very happy now that they've got the plant finished, because
and they're going to be happy for a long time. I mean, many people in Georgia of a certain age remember that the Vogtle 1 and 2 were some of the most expensive nuclear plants constructed at that time.
Right.
But they've been very happy that they did the job. And particularly now that, Vogtle 1 and 2 are probably fully depreciated and supplying really cheap power, and they'll continue supplying really cheap power for another 30 or 40 years.
Yeah. Well, and that's the similar story to what we saw here in Austin and Austin Energy. There were politicians in this town, and I know some of them who made their careers opposing the South Texas project, right? That, it's too expensive, and it's, they called it the nuke, and, it's cost overruns, and Brown and Root was involved, and therefore it's all bad, and the city should pull out. And I remember this is now close to 30 years ago. I was writing for the Austin Chronicle, and the city of Austin tried to sell its 16% share in the plant, and there were no takers. I mean, I think there was one bidder, a guy who said, "Oh, you pay me $1 million, I'll take it off your hands." Well, now it's the best investment the city ever made. I mean, by far. I mean, there's no second place, and we're getting electricity from that plant, I think, at about 2 or 3 cents kilowatt hour. I mean, it's dirt cheap compared to everything else on the system. And so, in retrospect, it was the right move, and it was fought bitterly by the liberals here, right? The progressives, and that many of them made their careers on that, and they don't talk about it now because it doesn't look so good, especially with this issue of climate change, right? So anyway, that's a little side note, little editorial note. So let's talk about uranium prices. So SMR stocks like NuScale, it's the only one. It's a ticker. It's SMR. Some of the enthusiasm for SMRs, let's face it, has cooled over the past few months. Uranium prices, though, have more than doubled this year. What's driving that? Is that excessive? I think I just looked at Cameco. Its price to earnings ratio is over 100. That's remarkable. Is this bullishness around uranium? Is this justified? If we talk about, you're in the investment business now, does this make sense that uranium is so high and that companies like Cameco are seeing such strong tailwinds in their stock price?
Well, I got to disclose that I'm a uranium investor as well as, we don't own it. We don't have any uranium at Nucleation Capital because uranium is, mostly even the tiny companies in uranium go public on some of the exchanges that are specialized for that. There's exchanges like the Toronto Stock Exchange in Canada, and there's one in Australia. So they don't necessarily do venture capital. They go out and go public and get people to jump on.
Right. Microcap miners that trade on Vancouver Exchange, I'm guessing, as well.
Yeah, exactly. But the big tailwind in uranium is the fact that we've had very low uranium prices for a very long time. Starting in around 2008, the uranium tanked like many other commodities did. And then in 2012, when Japan shut down most of its nuclear plants, by 2012, they started shutting them down in 2011. But by the end of 2012, all of Japan's nuclear plants were shut down. So that took they had 50 plants. That took a pretty significant demand out of the market. And then the owners of those plants had a bunch of inventory. They started selling it in the market. So that, the supply-demand balance was really, there was a lot of uranium available. And so the prices were very low, which means the miners stopped investing in new production. And some of the biggest miners cut back and stopped selling some of their most abundant, stopped selling from some of their most abundant and rich seams. The Cameco has some mines that are as much as 25% uranium in the ore.
Wow.
Now, around the world, there are mines operating profitably with 0.5% uranium.
Right.
So you got a mine that's 25%. You decide, hey, why am I giving away this product? So Kazatomprom, Cameco, a few other big players pulled stuff out of the market. And eventually, if you have a long period with very low prices, the mining capability, the mining capacity is way below what the actual demand is. Right now, with today's nuclear plants, we are not mining enough uranium to supply today's market. There's a lot of stuff still coming out of inventory, but the inventories are pretty much depleted now, the available inventories that can be sold in the market. And so it's time to start bringing on new capacity. Well, it takes 5-10 years. Once you've identified the reservoir or the resource, to create a mine and bring it into service. So there's a gap. There's a big current demand, an overhang of demand that is going to appear as we build more nuclear plants and as things like Japan brings its nuclear plants back in the market, which is not something that takes 10 years to do.
Right.
It's taken too long, but they really can turn on a nuclear plant in a year or so.
Right.
And bring that demand back into the market. So
it's bullish sentiment overall in the global market for nuclear, despite the setbacks here in the U.S. You've got also the Canadians are going to expand Bruce Power or double the scale, right, at Bruce, and then they're going to build the BWRX 300 at Darlington.
Yep.
They're refurbishing some of their other existing reactors, and then of course you got the demand from China with their reactors, et cetera. So globally, the U.S. nuclear sector is not the global sector, right? The global sector is going to continue.
It's not, but we do. I mean, we do have a lot of things looking up in the U.S. that are putting demand on uranium. We've got the advanced reactor demonstration projects in Wyoming and in Texas. We've got TVA and participating actively in the BWRX 300, and will be a fast follower according to I can't remember his name right now, but the CEO of TVA.
Okay.
He says he's not going to build one reactor. He's planning and he's carefully, going to build the first. But after he builds the first, he's going to build another 19. Duke Energy's got SMRs in its integrated resource plan for the first time in a number of years. Dominion's got advanced reactors in their IRPs. There's all kinds of interest in building new reactors. And we've had a lot of conversation in the U.S. about HALEU.
Right.
Well, to get the equivalent amount of fuel into a reactor using HALEU, it takes 4 times as much raw natural uranium to produce HALEU as it does to produce LEU. So you're going to have there's enormous demand for uranium coming up, and the supply constraints are there. So it's not surprising. But by the way, even with today's price, we're still at less than half of what uranium peaked at in 2007. 2007 uranium prices got to $147 a pound.
And now they're at 50. Is that right? What is it?
75.
75. And so, well, you said you're an investor. Well, let's talk turkey. So who do you like? What if you were going to buy a uranium miner? You're not nucleation capitalized. I guess, I don't know if you're investing in miners, but so who do you like?
I love Cameco. I mean, it's a great story. There's all kinds of reasons. They're a very well-established firm that's got great management and tremendous resources. So Cameco is a big part of my personal portfolio. There's a couple of small miners that have developments that are almost ready to come in service. Denison Mines, NextGen, those guys are getting close. There's a couple others. So yeah, it's kind of Cameco's big in my portfolio, my personal portfolio. I'm talking here is Rod Adams, not as
sure. Yeah, capital. Right. I got you.
But the small miners are also of interest. But I mean, I think Cameco's half of my uranium holdings. And then the others are
right. Well, so let's talk about fusion. This is one of the other areas that I've followed for a long time. And, as you've said, we're both in our dotage now. I'm 63. I've heard about fusion since I was 10 years old, and it's 20, 30, 40 years away. And I'll ask the question directly. Is fusion still 20, 30 or 40 years away? I mean, I've said this before. If fission works, why aren't we just focused on fission? Why do we need to spend why is there all this froth around fusion now? Because it seems to me still the problems that existed 20, 40, 30, 50 years ago were the same problems today. So I'll ask the question directly. I'm kind of rambling here. What about fusion? Are you bullish on fusion, or you still think that it's how far away is it today?
I attribute the excitement in fusion to the fact that physics professors throughout the country, maybe throughout the world, have been telling their bright students for 60 years that fusion is the ultimate energy source. And I actually support the idea when people say, well, it is the holy grail of energy. And I say, yep, it's exactly like the Holy Grail. It's mythical.
Uh-huh.
Okay. You will have all kinds of power and eternal youth and everything if you ever discover this Holy Grail, or if you
Right.
ever find it. It may exist somewhere. And obviously, fusion works on the sun. It works in thermonuclear weapons. You can do it on very small scale. You can make fusion work. And matter of fact, you're in Texas. You got a lot of fusion devices around your state. They use them in logging for oil wells, but they put a lot of electricity in them, and they make a few fusion reactions occur, and they can use the neutrons from there to detect things. I've held one in my hand, but it's not a particularly useful device in terms of producing energy. It produces fusion, which releases a 14 MeV neutron, which is a nice thing to have when you're trying to detect things underground. But fusion energy, no.
You're skeptical.
I hate the idea that people
you're skeptical.
I hate the idea of people talking about fusion as a cure for climate change. It just doesn't exist. And it's
right.
Once you get to having self-sustained chain reaction that actually produces a useful amount of power, you still have to design a power plant. You still have to build the power plant that's going to convert that heat into electricity. And it's not a simple task, because the heat comes out at initially at 100 million degrees Kelvin. It's pretty hot stuff.
So why is it attracting so much capital then? Because I think Commonwealth Fusion they've raised $3 billion, TAE hundreds of millions.
Because some of those bright physics students went on to make a lot of money in tech. They always thought about, hey, my professor told me that fusion would be a great thing to do. And so they've made all this money in tech, and they want to put it to use. They want to save the world. They want to save the world in a proprietary, solution
that they can sell.
That they can sell, maybe, or they can find somebody who's willing to buy. What is it? The next fuel, a greater fool thought theory. I don't know. We are a fusion investor, by the way. We have one investment in a fusion company because we really like their lasers.
So it's the laser, not necessarily the actual process itself. Then you're investing in a different part of their technology portfolio, or you're bullish on a different part of it.
Yeah, they are following the path that seems to have been the closest to actual fusion from the National Ignition Facility. They have much, much better lasers than were installed in a National Ignition Facility when it was built 15 years ago. And so they look like, if there's going to be a breakthrough, we think that they're close. But even if there's not a breakthrough, they've got some really terrific laser technologies and some amazingly bright people. So that's
Well, so let's talk about since we're talking about commodities, we talked about uranium. Let's talk about natural gas. I think we were at the same meeting, and I think it was in Salt Lake City, and it was probably 10 years ago. And it was an executive from Exelon, I think, who was lecturing or giving his presentation. And I asked him, I said, and maybe you remember this, what price do you need natural gas to be? What price do you need for nat gas for you to justify a new nuclear plant in the United States? And he said, if I'm remembering correctly, $8 per MMBTU. And
that's
he said,
exactly the number I was remembering.
And he said, we need another $8 in a carbon price or something like that. So we need nat gas to effectively be $16. Now, you talked about nat gas in the West and the abundance of nat gas. I'm looking at the Henry Hub front month price now, $2.91. Is that, because gas is so cheap, is that going to be one of the things that is going to just hinder the growth of nuclear then for as long as gas is cheap?
I think so. I think cheap natural gas will hinder the development of nuclear. It has for the last dozen years, actually 15 years now.
Yeah.
Since 2007, when gas prices tanked during the global financial crisis.
Right.
Or maybe that was the summer 2008. Sometimes my history is a little bit odd.
I think it was 8, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So gas prices are cheap, and they definitely have impacted nuclear, and they will impact nuclear as long as they're cheap and there's no price on carbon.
Right.
However, I am skeptical about the fact that about the predictions of them remaining cheap.
Yeah.
Partly because I remember being very interested in natural gas prices in the 1990s, watching gas prices from 91 to 96 drop from $4 a million BTU down to about $1.50. And then having people proclaim through 1999 that gas prices were going to remain low. And the Energy Information Agency said that they're going to increase at slightly below the rate of inflation from 1999 at $1.60 million BTU.
Right.
What were they in 2008 when they crashed? Over $12 a million BTU.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. I knew it was over. It was over 10. I knew it was over $10, and that's the worry.
$12 was the electric generation price. Other people were paying as much as $15 a million BTU for wholesale prices.
Right.
So what's happening in the natural gas world today? I'm a big fan of Adam Rosenzweig and Goring.
Yeah.
They're real bullish on gas prices. And of course, bullish on gas prices means they're betting they're going to go up.
Right.
Partly because of things like in the next year, the U.S. LNG export capacity is going to increase by 50%.
Right.
And that means that instead of exporting 10% of our production, we're going to be exporting 15% of our production.
Yeah. So
that starts to increase or change the supply-demand balance. There's also an indication among some people that we've been doing really well in fracking and making fracking look more and more efficient.
Right.
By focusing on the most productive areas of the various reservoirs. You can only do that for so long before the most productive areas are no longer the most productive areas.
Right.
Because you suck the gas out. So how much longer are we going to be able to maintain our current production? Who knows? You have to keep drilling. You have to keep drilling a lot to maintain production. And we'll see how that
I'm just looking here. I just pulled it up because I was looking at this. The quarterly average residential natural gas price in 1981, the real price, now nominal is different, right? It was $4 in 1981. The real price, according to the EIA, is $14. That's in 1981. And now I'm pushing forward here to 2023 second quarter real price, $16.48. So compared to $14, I mean, it's essentially the same price today as it was 40 years ago. I mean, it's a remarkable technology story, right? And so I hear what you're saying about high grading and the exports and the rest of it, and I've heard that story before, but I also am a believer in technology and what we've seen in the shale revolution, and talking to drillers, talking to frackers, they're figuring out ways to wring more and more oil and gas out of lower quality rock. And so I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew, but I think hydrocarbons are here to stay, but at what price?
There's no doubt that we're going to keep using hydrocarbons, and there's going to be, look around the world, there's a big market for gas, even if it costs $15 a million BTU or $20 a million BTU. There's a big market. People need to burn to do what they need to do. But the U.S. ability to be so much lower than the rest of the world prices, I think is going to come to an end. And certainly there are people that are excited about bringing more stuff out of the rocks.
Right.
But are they willing to keep selling it for such a discount?
Right.
Or are they excited about the idea of moving the discount or lessening the discount away? The people that sell gas aren't as motivated to keep the price low as some might think they are.
Yeah.
Well,
they're always looking for the higher price, but that, and this is a long time ago. I was in Paris and I met with, I forgot what his name is. He's at Shell now, Laszlo Varro, And he said that nuclear is going to be more attractive in Europe for a long time because Europeans are paying more for natural gas. So I'm just looking at I just mentioned Henry Hub today is at 290. The front month price for nat gas at TTF, which is the Dutch trading hub, is $14.70. So almost 5x, right? Roughly 5x the US price. So that's going to make nuclear more attractive in Europe. So handicap Europe for me. We talked about Poland. I had Bill Magwood on the podcast a few months ago. He said France is where he thinks the first new reactors are going to come online in Europe. What about you? Where do you? There are a bunch of paper reactor companies that are vying for in the European space. Brett Kugelmass has a company they're aiming for that market. You got the BWRX 300. You got the AP 1000. Handicap Europe for me. Who do you think is going to take the lead there in terms of deploying new nuclear?
Well, if they could stop fighting with the Russians, the Ukrainians are near the top of the list. They want more nuclear there. Poles are very interested in moving to nuclear to lessen their dependence on coal.
Sure.
You've got Sweden is a really interesting play to me because people forget that Sweden, very small little country of 12 or 14 million people, they built enough nuclear plants in 15 years to supply half of their electricity. And they did it with their own designs. They didn't go buy Westinghouse or GE designs. They built their own nuclear plants. Now they're boiling water reactors. They're fairly traditional light water reactors, but they're Swedish design. And so they had an independent regulator, an independent system, and they built the plants. For a long time, they've been anti-nuclear, but several years ago, the population of Sweden elected a very overtly pro-nuclear coalition, and they are changing the rules and making it possible to bring on new nuclear plants. They've got full disclosure here, we have an investment in a Swedish nuclear power plant developer called Vogtle, which translates to lead cooled. It's a lead cooled fast reactor, but they've got some really high quality nuclear experts. They've never lost their nuclear expertise. They've got a strong regulator. And they're changing their regulations to make it more straightforward to get a plant license there. Great Britain has Great British Nuclear. They've kind of gone fits and starts with support, but they're moving on from Hinkley C to Sizewell C, and they've got small modular reactor competitions going on with their own hometown favorite of Rolls-Royce, but they've got, I think there's a list of 6, and some people will say, well, they're all light water. Of course, they're all light water reactors because that was the initial criteria, was they want something they can build right away. So it's a light water reactor competition for the first 6, but they're interested in high temperature gas reactors and other technologies. Mostly high temperature gas is a big leader in Great Britain because they're used to gas cooled reactors. Of the reactors operated in Britain over the last 50 years, all but one have been gas cooled, CO2 gas, but still a gas cooled reactor.
Interesting.
Let's see who else.
Well, so Sweden, that's an interesting.
Italy may even join the fray. There's talk about Italy becoming a new nuclear plant owner. They got out of the business and after Chernobyl, but they want to come back in. So
is it fair to say this time it is different when it comes to nuclear globally? That this time, after we've heard this, we've agreed we're both old men now, that this time it is different?
It is different. There's so many positive pushes for nuclear. First of all, unlike the 1970s, where people had a legitimate question about safety and security and what do you do with the waste, those were all legitimate questions that we didn't really have answers for.
Right.
But now we've got 60 years of history that show that the overall technology base between regulators and designers and operators, we know how to operate nuclear safely. We know how to operate reliably. Instead of having capacity factors of 65% in the 1970s, we have 90 to 93%, depending on what year. Sometimes, not only do we have power average fleet-wide capacity factors of 92%, every year there's between 15 and 22 U.S. nuclear plants that operate for 100% of the hours in a year at 100% power.
Yeah.
Okay. They don't refuel during that particular year. They go for the whole year, breaker to breaker, nothing. They're always at max. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and we also know how to use nuclear fuel safely. Do we have an ultimate disposal? No, but we store it safely.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because that was in fact one of the questions. That there are 14 states, I think this is still the right list, that have restrictions on the construction of new nuclear power facilities: California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and West Virginia. Now, maybe
West Virginia's off the list.
West Virginia's off the
list. Illinois is off the list.
Okay. So then, but there are 6 have regulations that prohibit new reactors unless there's a demonstrable technology or means for high-level waste disposal or reprocessing. Now, I think I have West Virginia here, but California, Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, Oregon, and West Virginia. So are Illinois and West Virginia off of that list as well now?
Yeah, Illinois and West Virginia. West Virginia, a year or so ago,
right, and Illinois just in the last few weeks, right?
So within the last week, I think.
Yeah. So what about the waste? I mean, I know I've written about this, and I've written about it many times. And there was the Harry Reid problem with Obama. Well, I'll support you, but you have to kill Yucca Mountain. And Obama dutifully did so. And now we are back at not square one, but maybe only square 1.5 or something. I don't know where, but you said we can store it safely, but meaning right now storing it safely means in dry casks on the sites of the existing nuclear plants. You think that's just just enough for that for now, that we should just, let's go ahead and we will deal with that later? How do you think about that problem? Because that's that one issue, that challenge. How do you think about that? Because that's the opponents are always going to say, we can't handle the waste. How do you reply to that?
Well, first of all, some opponents are going to say whatever they need to say.
Of course.
It doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in truth or facts. I mean, some people are going to be, we have to understand there are going to be people opposed to nuclear no matter what happens.
Sure.
There's way too much money involved in energy for people to give up fighting such an amazing competitor.
Right.
So I can't please everybody. So I'll stop trying.
Sure.
And of course, I've got documents dating back to the 1990s when the coalitions, the official coalitions that got together to the Critical Mass Energy Project, got together in D.C. and gave a list of things that they would do, and emphasizing the waste issue was part of that list of things they would do to stop nuclear. I can share you a link on my site. But anyway,
that's 50 years ago.
Yeah, but the dry casks are adequate, and they're safe for at least 100 years. Right. That's a pretty good solution to any industrial problem. But that doesn't stop us from working on solutions. And by the way, once again, I got to disclose, Nucleation Capital has investment in a company called Deep Isolation, which I think is just a very creative company, started by a father-daughter team, the Mullers. Richard Muller is one of the most respected professors of energy. He's written books, Energy for Presidents. He's just a smart guy. But he looked at the problem. He says, around the world, scientists have agreed, with all the countries, they've agreed that if you need to dispose of nuclear waste safely, deep geologic repositories are the best way to do it.
Right.
They will isolate the waste for millions of years, if that's what you need to do. And so there's lots of effort. That Yucca Mountain was a deep geologic repository. The Finnish is a deep geologic repository. The UK, France, China, they're all doing, France, Canada, they're all doing deep geologic repositories. But they've all been predicated on the idea of digging a great big mine,
right,
and putting it down with vehicles and access and elevators and ventilation systems and all that. Richard Muller says, well, we drill deep holes in the ground all the time. We've got this great drilling technology that goes way deeper than you can mine. It
Sure.
goes down thousands of feet. And then now these days, you don't just drill a straight hole. You can turn the drill bit and go horizontally.
Right.
So he
Well,
said, wow,
I've had Elizabeth
imagine
Muller.
if you could just put your assemblies down this deep hole, go horizontally. You got a mile or 2 mile long laterals, and you can just stack the assemblies. And these things are 5,000, 10,000 feet underground,
Right.
way below any aquifers, into
Sure.
stable layers of rock that you can tell have been there for millennia, bazillions of years, however. It's forever. If you can find layers of rock that have gas in them, you can find layers of rock that have other characteristics.
Sure.
And so deep
So
isolation, I
right.
think, is.
Yeah, and I've had Elizabeth Muller on the podcast to talk about this. So it's a promising technology, but the waste issue is still one that we've got to deal with. But we're coming up on about an hour, and I've have failed to make a station break here to remind our listeners who I'm talking to. This is Rod Adams. He is a managing partner at Nucleation Capital and publisher of Atomic Insights. You can find him at nucleationcapital.com and atomicinsights.com. Rod, we just have a few minutes left. I want to keep our podcast at about an hour. So, what are you reading these days? I ask these questions of all my podcast guests. What's on the top of your book list?
Let's see. I usually prepare for this, but I didn't.
That's okay. You can.
I got to admit that because
here.
I spent so much time reading reports and financial statements and projections and presentations and all stuff, when I am not doing that work, I have been digging into a whole bunch of different series of books by writers. They call themselves the tropical authors, and they write books, and many of them publish them on Kindle Unlimited. And I'm a fast reader. I love to read novels. So I've been reading tropical authors like Wayne Sinnott and Matt Lincoln and a few others, and they all focus on stories that are the places they do are my home areas: the Keys, Florida, the Gulf, boating, scuba diving, sailing, all kinds of things in their adventures. And I'm kind of a Jimmy Buffett fan, so it kind of fits into that same category. All these guys talk about, and every once in a while, Jimmy will make a guest appearance in their novels. So that's what I read in my free time.
So, well, is it Carl Hyacin, right? Isn't he the Florida's iconic novelist as well? Are you a fan of his?
I've got a full collection of Carl Hyacin's book. I do like his books. I haven't read any recently. I think he's slowed down a little bit, but he writes some very interesting books inspired by the oddities that call themselves Floridians.
and well, I was in Florida. I was there recently. Well, what is it then? Well, explain that if you don't mind. The oddities about Floridians. What is it? You're a native. What is it? What's the
well? Thing? Hyacin was a columnist and a reporter for the Miami Herald.
Right.
And people ask him where he gets his ideas for characters. Like there was one character in a series, I can't remember his name, but I think they called him Skink. He was a former Florida governor who decided to drop out of society, and he wanders around the Everglades and to fake out naturalists who are trying to track cougars. He found a tracker, so he wears it around his neck, and they think they're dragging a cougar around. He eats roadkill. I mean, just kind of weird characters. But Hyacin will say he found people like this in his reporting. There's people that are in his books. There's drug dealers. There's people that are bodybuilders who go steroid nuts. There's I guess Striptease was a movie that was built on one of Hyacinth's books, and a character who is a real nasty character that nobody likes. He ends up getting chewed up by a sugarcane harvester. It's all kinds of weird stuff in his books. But this is what and he's very much opposed to the mouse that ate Orlando, and
Right. Yeah, I got you. What gives you hope, Rod?
My knowledge of fission, and I specifically said fission because going back to our conversation about fission works. It's worked at all temperatures. All you got to do is pile enough of the right materials together, and it works. You can control it by having some absorbers. It's simple. I don't know if you've seen it, but I was an interviewed expert for Oliver Stone's Nuclear Now, and I pointed out that one of the easiest jobs in the U.S. Navy is being the easiest watch standing jobs is to be the reactor operator on watch on a submarine, because the reactor controls itself, and it's not because it's got real fancy control systems. It's because the physics of the reactor make it want to stay at the same temperature and want to produce exactly as much steam as you ask it to produce. You open the throttles, it produces more power. You reduce the throttles, it reduces more power. It's just a simple system, and it works, and it's so incredible. You know, pellets this big has as much energy as a ton of coal. There's no emissions to get rid of. There's no need for smokestacks. You can run it inside a sealed submarine. There's an abundance of uranium around the world. And oh, by the way, if you run out of uranium, you can always look to thorium. And you don't need to run out. You can do both. You can use plutonium. You can use spent fuel. All the stuff that we call nuclear waste, or most of it, is still usable as fuel. It's just incredible. And we have this at our fingertips. We have the ability to train people. It's not that hard to learn how to do nuclear power. You don't have to, you don't have to know the details of fission anymore. You need to know the details of the combustion in your car engine. You turn the key, it works. In a nuclear plant, you turn the rods, you make it work. You can train people to do this effectively. We have such an abundance of energy, and if you've got energy, you can do anything. You can recycle any materials. You can go to landfills and turn them into mines. You can use plasma torches. You can do all kinds of neat stuff. You can create fresh water. You can make the deserts bloom. You can do all this stuff with energy. And we've got it in our fingertips. So yeah, I've got hope. Of course, sometimes I get into deep depressions because I see people that will talk all about the challenges of energy and the crisis of climate change, but they refuse to even say the word nuclear. It's like Voldemort. It's the name that can't be spoken. And I kind of know why. I don't like it, and I want to fight it. I want to tell people, stop talking about energy security without saying nuclear. Talking about climate change without saying nuclear. I'm not saying it's the only solution, but it's got to be part of the conversation. It's ridiculous to eliminate it. It's crazy. Anyway. Say their name. What do they keep saying? Say the name. Say nuclear and talk about it. Let people understand what it is we're fighting for. What kind of world can we have if we enable nuclear to flourish? If it's regulations or if it's perceptions that are the problem, well, we can change human minds a lot easier than we can change physics, and certainly a lot easier than we can change the rotation schedule of the Earth, which is what drives other energy sources.
Right.
We can't stop that, or we can't start it at will.
Well, that's a good place to stop for today. So let's do that. My guest again has been my friend, Rod Adams. He's a managing partner at Nucleation Capital and publisher of Atomic Insights, nucleationcapital.com, atomicinsights.com. Check him out there. Rod, thanks again for coming back on the Power Hungry podcast. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Robert. And if it's always a pleasure, you got to invite me more often than once every 3 years.
We will make that happen. That was my oversight, and I'm glad we made it happen belatedly. But we won't make it 3 years next time. I promise. So,
all right.
And thanks to all of you out there in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.